The German blitzkrieg had begun as a thunderclap in June 1941, tearing through the Soviet Union at a pace that stunned the world. But by the first week of September, the tempo was changing. The summer sun that had baked the dusty fields of Ukraine and Belarusia was now giving way to autumn rains. At first it was a drizzle, almost refreshing to exhausted soldiers who had marched for weeks. But soon, as the Italian journalist Curzio Malaparte described, it became a hurricane. Roads dissolved into black rivers of mud, supply trucks spun helplessly, and horses collapsed under the strain of artillery wagons. For the Wehrmacht, whose entire strength lay in speed and momentum, this was a dangerous sign. Blitzkrieg required movement, but the front was beginning to slow. And yet, Hitler was still chasing victories of unimaginable scale. 3 prizes lay before him: Leningrad in the north, Kyiv in the south, and Moscow in the center. If all 3 could be taken, Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse before winter. In August, he had vacillated, sometimes prioritizing Ukraine's breadbasket, sometimes Moscow's symbolic power. But now, in early September, he was determined to have it all. On September 6th, he issued War Directive No. 35, declaring that the capture of Moscow was once again the key objective. Kyiv would still be destroyed, and Leningrad would be starved into submission. But Moscow was to be the grand prize that ended the campaign of 1941 in triumph. The German High Command knew the risks. Army Group Center was stretched thin. Bleeding men and resources at Yelna. Guderian's panzers were far to the south, trying to close the jaws around Kyiv, while Rundstedt and Kleist battled desperately to secure crossings over the Dnipro River. To the north, Lieb's Army Group North pressed toward Leningrad, but the once lightning-fast advance now slowed to a crawl of just 1.5 kilometers a day. German soldiers were exhausted, supplies scarce, and the Soviets were proving far more resilient than Berlin had promised. For the Soviets, September was both catastrophe and hope. Kyiv was on the edge of disaster, its defenders trapped by the sweeping German pincers. Leningrad was cut off from the Soviet Union, connected only by the thin lifeline of Lake Ladoga, and Moscow was under renewed threat. Hitler's armies poised to strike again at the very heart of the USSR. But amid the ruin, there were flickers of resistance. At Yelna, Soviet troops under Zhukov were about to achieve something unthinkable: retaking a city from the Wehrmacht. It would come at an unbearable cost, but it was proof that the Germans could be beaten. The autumn rains, Hitler's shifting directives, and the first Soviet counterblows all converged in the first week of September 1941. The German war machine was still advancing, but it was no longer unstoppable. The Eastern Front was beginning to transform from a war of rapid conquests into a grinding struggle where mud weather and sheer human endurance would decide the outcome. By the dawn of September 1941, the fate of Leningrad, Russia's great northern capital, on the Nevos, hanging by a thread. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, had advanced relentlessly through the Baltics, crushing Estonian defenses and brushing aside General Vatatin's desperate counteroffensives. By late August, the Germans had seized MGA, the last critical railway hub feeding into Leningrad. For a single day, NKVD troops retook the town in a daring counterattack, but the victory was fleeting. The German 20th Motorized Division swept them aside, reclaiming the shattered rail junction. That brief Soviet success was like a candle in the wind, quickly extinguished, but remembered for its defiance. The German advance was now methodical, slower than in July, but deadly. In early September, their divisions seized Sinovino, followed by Schlisselburg. With these towns gone, the city's last land and rail connections to the Soviet Union were severed. The once vast supply arteries had been reduced to a single tenuous link across Lake Ladoga, soon to be remembered as the Road of Life. Inside Leningrad, the mood was a mix of terror and resolve. Civilians dug trenches, women and children filled sandbags, and the great factories of the city churned out weapons under the constant thunder of artillery. The population knew what was coming. Stalin had ordered that the city must not fall. Lenin was not only the cradle of the 1917 revolution, but also a major industrial powerhouse. To surrender it would be unthinkable. Yet the people were trapped. 3 million civilians and hundreds of thousands of soldiers locked inside a tightening new start for the Germans. Exhaustion was setting in. They had advanced 5 kilometers a day in July, but by September, progress slowed to barely 1.5. Supplies trickled along overstretched lines. Troops were fatigued, and Soviet resistance grew more determined with every kilometer. Many German soldiers believed their work was done. Leningrad, cut off and starved, would surely surrender within weeks. But they underestimated the resilience of the city. The coming winter would not bring capitulation, but one of the most brutal sieges in human history. For now, in September, the siege had begun. Leningrad was isolated, its people staring into the abyss of hunger and death, while the Germans settled in to wait for the city to starve. While the German pincers closed in from the south and east, another shadow loomed from the north, Finland. The Finnish army, embittered from the Winter War of 1939-40, had advanced across the Karelian Isthmus. By early September 1941, their lines pressed dangerously close to the northern outskirts of Leningrad. Though Marshal Mannerheim had no intention of storming the city itself, Soviet intelligence could not be certain. For the defenders of Leningrad, the possibility of a combined German-Finnish assault was a nightmare scenario. Lieutenant General Mikhail Popov was tasked with holding the northern approaches. His orders were clear: push the Finns back at all costs, but Popov had few forces at his disposal. The northern front was already stretched to the breaking point, its armies bloodied by weeks of retreat and reorganization. On September 1st, Stavka officially divided the front into two: the Leningrad front, charged with defending the city itself, and the Karelian front, responsible for holding back the Finns. This administrative reshuffle reflected the seriousness of the threat. Stalin feared not only German tanks, but also a Finnish strike that could cut Leningrad off entirely from the north. The Soviet High Command could not know that Mannerheim had his own limits. He was determined to regain the territories Finland had lost in 1940, but he hesitated to push further. The political cost of openly joining in the destruction of Leningrad weighed heavily on him, and his army lacked the strength for an urban assault of that magnitude. Still, his restraint did little to calm Soviet nerves. To Moscow, every Finnish advance seemed part of Hitler's grand design to strangle the city from all directions. As September wore on, Popov scraped together whatever units he could to counter Finnish moves, but his hands were tied. The Germans remained the greater threat, and most reinforcements were thrown against Gleb's armies rather than Mannerheim's. The result was a stalemate north of the city, one that left Leningrad hemmed in on nearly every side. The stage was now set for a siege unlike any in modern warfare. The Germans prepared to wait, the Finns lurked in the north, and the Soviets braced themselves for a trial of endurance. Leningrad, a jewel of Russian culture and industry, was about to be transformed into a vast prison where hunger would kill more than bombs or bullets. While Leningrad was sealed off, the center of the front convulsed with one of the fiercest battles yet. East of Smolensk, the Yelna salient jutted out like a dagger into Soviet lines. It was held by just 4 German infantry divisions, 268th, 292nd, 78th, and 137th, thrown together to relieve the panzers who had raced ahead. For weeks, Soviet commanders Timoshenko and Zhukov had battered the salient with wave after wave of assaults. By September 1st, the storm broke in full. The 16th, 19th, and 20th armies struck along the front, while the 24th and 43rd armies concentrated on the salient itself. The Germans, lacking tanks and short of artillery, clung desperately to their trenches. Officers wrote grim reports. Ammunition was rationed, counterattacks impossible, and every Soviet breakthrough threatened to unravel the entire position. For the Red Army, Yelna was more than a battlefield. It was a chance to prove that the Wehrmacht could be beaten. Soviet soldiers charged again and again into withering fire, suffering catastrophic losses. Yet slowly, step by bloody step, they gained ground. By September 4th, the German commander, Field Marshal von Bock, could no longer ignore reality. If he held Yelna any longer, his divisions risked annihilation. He gave the order to withdraw across the Dnipro River. The retreat was executed in good order, saving the German units from destruction. On September 5th, Yelna fell to troops. The cost was staggering: 32,000 Soviet casualties, including 2 armored divisions shattered beyond repair. But the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time since June, Soviet soldiers had retaken a city from the Germans. Propaganda hailed it as proof that the tide could be turned. For the Wehrmacht, the loss of Yelna was less about territory than prestige. The myth of German invincibility had been dented, yet victory was bittersweet. Stalin had demanded an encirclement, the total destruction of the German salient. Instead, the enemy had slipped away. For the Soviets, the lesson was clear: beating the Germans would always require a terrible price in blood. Even as Yelna fell, Hitler's mind was already turning toward the next great objective. On September 6th, he issued Directive No. 35, a sweeping order that reoriented the entire campaign. The focus would once again be Moscow. Kyiv must fall first. But once Guderian's panzers had completed the encirclement in Ukraine, they would turn north. To support him, Hobner's 4th Panzer Group and Hoff's 3rd Panzer Group would be released from their current operations. Bach, commander of Army Group Center, was to prepare the great drive on Moscow. Hitler's reasoning was political as much as military. He knew the war could not be won in 1941, but he wanted to end the year on a high note. If he could claim Kyiv, Moscow, and Leningrad all subdued or under siege, he could tell the German people that final victory was assured. The reality on the ground was far darker. His armies were overstretched, his supply lines strained, and the Soviet Union was proving far more resilient than expected. But Hitler clung to the belief that one more decisive blow could shatter Stalin's empire. The Directive reignited old debates within the German command. Some generals favored deep encirclements, trapping Soviet armies far behind the lines. Others argued for closer, tighter pockets that guaranteed destruction. Directive 35 made Hitler's preference clear: close encirclements, swift and brutal. Bach had his marching orders, and for the Wehrmacht, the road to Moscow was open again if they could first finish the job at Kyiv. While Hitler plotted his next offensive, Zhukov and Timoshenko pressed their counterattacks. The liberation of Yelna emboldened the Red Army, and fresh reserves were poured into the fight. On September 1st, massive assaults struck across Army Group Center's lines, stretching from Iartsevo. German units, already strained, bent under the pressure. For the first time, Soviet tactics showed signs of improvement. Coordination was still shaky, but artillery was massed effectively, and infantry pressed relentlessly. German commanders described the fighting as trench warfare, a grim echo of the First World War. Local penetrations threatened to spiral into breakthroughs, forcing constant redeployments. The Germans managed to withdraw in time, preventing encirclement, but the strain was evident. 10,000 German casualties had been suffered holding Yelna alone, and now more losses piled up daily. The Red Army, though bleeding even more heavily, was learning. The myth of effortless German superiority was fading. Stalin, however, was dissatisfied. He had wanted the destruction of entire German corps, not just the liberation of ground. To him, Zhukov's victory was incomplete. Yet for the men on the ground, it was a desperately needed proof that the Germans could be pushed back. Farther south, Colonel General Andrei Eremenko prepared a strike of his own, ordered by Stalin himself to smash Guderian to smithereens. He assembled a force of cavalry, tank brigades, and rifle divisions to hit the exposed northern flank of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group. His target, General Arnim's 17th Panzer Division, a unit with barely 50 operational tanks, stretched across 60 kilometers of front. On paper, the Soviets had the advantage. T-34s and KV-1 South outnumbered the German panzers, and morale was high after Yelna. But poor coordination doomed the plan from the start. Reconnaissance was weak, units attacked piecemeal, and communication broke down. On September 1st, the 108th Tank Division was surrounded in the woods. Eremenko, unwilling to delay his timetable, did nothing to rescue them. By September 4th, the division broke out, leaving behind nearly all of its armor. The offensive collapsed into chaos. Units attacked blindly, often stumbling into German ambushes. Lemelson's 47th Panzer Corps, though stretched thin, held firm. By the end of the week, Eremenko's command was a ruin. 100,000 casualties had been suffered for no gain at all. To maintain discipline, he requested permission to use blocking detachments and KVD troops, ordered to shoot any soldier who retreated without authorization. Stalin approved. Eremenko's failure meant Guderian's southern thrust remained intact. The German drive on Kyiv could proceed, and the Soviet southwestern front remained trapped in place. In the south, Field Marshal Rundstedt and Guderian prepared to close the trap around Kyiv. Bridgeheads at Kremenchug and Dnipropetrovsk were expanded despite ferocious Soviet counterattacks. At Kremenchug, 80 Soviet tanks launched a desperate assault, only to be destroyed almost to the last. At Dnipropetrovsk, bridges were destroyed repeatedly by artillery, bombers, even a crashing airplane. One German company was reduced from over 100 men to just 20 survivors. And then the skies opened. The September rains poured endlessly, turning the Ukrainian steppe into an ocean of mud. Trucks stalled, tanks bogged down, horses slipped and broke their legs. It sometimes took 10 hours to move 20 kilometers. German soldiers cursed the weather, but they had no choice. The encirclement had to continue. The Soviets resisted fiercely. The 38th Army fought tooth and nail to hold the Dnipro line, while in Kyiv itself, defenses stiffened, yet Stalin's refusal to allow a retreat sealed their fate. As Guderian pressed south and Kleist pushed north, the jaws began to close. Kyiv was doomed, though its defenders fought with desperate courage. The first week of September marked a turning point. Blitzkrieg was slowing, its lightning replaced by mud, attrition, and exhaustion. German divisions dissolved battalions just to maintain fighting strength. Soviet armies suffered catastrophic losses, but their resistance was stiffening. What had begun in June as a war of annihilation was becoming something far more brutal. War of endurance, where weather, distance, and human willpower would prove as decisive as tanks and planes. The Eastern Front was entering a new phase, one that would last not weeks or months, but years.